Anybody paying attention to recent events in America cannot help but realize that all is not well with a lot of the country's black people. Juneteenth is coming up, an event celebrating a milestone along blacks' arduous and unfinished march towards freedom and equality. It is a good time to examine some lesser-known facts of black American history. Juneteenth commemorates the belated arrival of freedom to enslaved black Texans. At the end of the Civil War, the freeing of black Americans during and after the Civil War was in turn a delayed liberation that could have occurred generations earlier, during the American Revolution. One of the Revolution's lesser-known facts is that many black Americans, especially enslaved blacks, saw the British, and not the Patriots, as the side offering freedom and liberty. Following are 20 things about Juneteenth and other lesser-known facts from black history. Number 20. Seating black fighting men. With British prospects in Virginia collapsing, Lord Dunmore disbanded the Ethiopian Regiment in 1776. The experiment had nonetheless demonstrated that black runaway slaves were of military value both in combat and in support functions. Many of the Ethiopian regiment's alumni joined other units, particularly the Black Pioneers in New York. A former member, an escaped New Jersey slave named Titus Cornelius, gained renown, or from a Patriot perspective, notoriety as a Loyalist guerrilla leader nicknamed Colonel Ty. The Ethiopian regiment marked a significant step in British policy, as its members were the first of thousands of escaped slaves who fought for the British during the war. The recruitment of black soldiers by the British also led the Continental Congress to override George Washington's wishes to keep blacks out of the Continental Army. In 1777, Congress restored the eligibility of blacks to serve in Continental forces, which Washington had rescinded in 1775. Number 19. Armed blacks in the South. In April 1776, a British expedition into North Carolina, under the command of General Henry Clinton, was joined by 71 escaped slaves. Clinton took an immediate liking to the black runaways and formed them into a company that came to be known as the Black Pioneers. He placed a Royal Marine lieutenant in charge, assisted by white subalterns and black noncommissioned officers. The rank and file were comprised of escapees, mostly from North and South Carolina, plus a few from Georgia. Clinton ordered that the black pioneers be treated with respect and decency, and that they be adequately clothed and fed. He also promised the runaways emancipation at the end of the war. Clinton's North Carolina expedition ended in failure, but he took the black pioneers with him when he sailed north, where they participated in that city's capture by the British in 1776. Number 18. The Black Loyalist Company. Later in 1776, General Clinton was tasked with taking Newport, Rhode Island, and the Black Pioneers were the only provincial unit that accompanied his British regulars. From Rhode Island, they were sent back to New York, and thence to Philadelphia, which fell to the British in 1777. In 1777, Clinton's runaways became the nucleus of the Black Loyalist Company, a non-combatant force to replace Lord Dunmore's disbanded Ethiopian Regiment. In 1778, the company was merged into the Guides and Pioneers in New York, and given the name the Black Pioneers and Guides. As pioneers, the new unit's soldiers were tasked with military engineering, fortification and construction tasks. As guides, they served as scouts and raiders. Number 17. The Black Pioneers. The Black Pioneers were not treated as a standard regiment. Instead, they were parceled out in small ad hoc units, typically companies of about 30 men each, that were attached to British armies. They served those armies by performing scouting, raiding, and military engineering missions. In their role as engineers, they were not a fighting unit, but they were often called upon to work under heavy fire, digging and shoring up entrenchments and fortifications. In 1779, Clinton sailed to besiege Charleston, South Carolina, and took the Black Pioneers with him. They performed vital military engineering tasks that contributed to the city's fall. The company then returned with Clinton to New York, where they remained until the end of the war. The Black Pioneers were one of the last provincial units remaining in New York, and accompanied the British when they evacuated the city in 1783. Number 16. Washington's slave. One of the black bondsmen who responded to Lord Dunmore's promise of freedom for slaves who fled their rebel masters was Harry Washington. In 1776, they ran away from Mount Vernon, the plantation of the rebel army's commander-in-chief, and future first president of the United States, George Washington. Harry succeeded in evading pursuit and made it to safety behind British lines, where he enlisted in the Ethiopian Regiment. Harry had been born in the Gambia River region in West Africa circa 1740. He was captured by slavers and transported across the Atlantic surviving the horrific Middle Passage to disembark in Virginia around 1760, where he was bought by a plantation owner. After his master's death in 1763, Harry was bought by George Washington, who put him to work draining swamps in southeast Virginia. Number 15. Turning down the benevolence of slavery. Harry Washington spent years toiling in appalling conditions, enveloped by heat, humidity and clouds of mosquitoes, before he was taken to his master's plantation, Mount Vernon. There he was tasked with looking after Washington's horses. In 1771, he was demoted from his skilled tasks, and was sent back to grueling manual labor that prompted him to flee, but he was recaptured a few weeks later and was restored to slavery. In 1775, the Revolutionary War started, and Virginia's governor offered slaves their freedom if they fought for the British. Mount Vernon's manager assembled the plantation slaves and urged them to trust the benevolence of slavery's paternalism over the precarious dangers of freedom. Harry preferred the dangers of freedom over the benevolence of slavery. Risking savage penalties if caught, he fled Mount Vernon along with 2 other black bondsmen. Number 14. Corporal Washington. Harry Washington evaded the slave patrols in pursuit and made it to British lines, where he enlisted in the Ethiopian Regiment. He survived the epidemic diseases that racked the unit, as well as the fighting in Virginia. In 1776, the British position in Virginia became hopeless, prompting the evacuation of the state and the disbandment of the Ethiopian Regiment. Harry then sailed to New York, where he joined the Black Pioneers, serving in a company attached to a British artillery unit. He was promoted to corporal and accompanied Henry Clinton's British Army in its invasion of South Carolina. There in 1781, Corporal Washington was placed in charge of a pioneer unit attached to the Royal Artillery Department in Charleston. After the war, he was evacuated to Nova Scotia. Later he joined the first group of colonial black migrants who were returned to Africa, settling in Sierra Leone. In 1800, he joined a brief rebellion against British rule. The rebellion was swiftly crushed, and Harry Washington was arrested, convicted of sedition and sentenced to internal banishment elsewhere in Sierra Leone. There, he died of illness soon thereafter. Number 13. The Black Brigade. Titus Cornelius, better known as Colonel Ty, was born a slave around 1753 in Monmouth County, New Jersey. He grew up toiling in the farm of a Quaker owner named John Corliss, who parted company with his denomination's growing opposition to slavery. The few Quakers who did own slaves were in the habit of teaching their black bondsmen how to read and write, then freeing them at age 21. Not so Titus' master, who not only refused to educate his slaves, but was a cruel master to boot. Slavery was gradually declining in New Jersey, and Titus' master became one of the last few slaveholders in Monmouth County. As Titus grew up, he was frequently whipped for trifles, and witnessed other slaves enduring the same cruelties from Corliss. When Titus reached 21, the age when most owners in the region, particularly Quakers, typically freed their slaves, it became clear that Corliss had no intention of freeing him, so he freed himself. Number 12. Self-help. In 1775, upon realizing that his master had no intention of freeing him, Titus Cornelius decided to free himself by running away. Lucky for him, he fled one day after Virginia's governor had issued a proclamation offering freedom to all slaves who escaped their American masters to serve the British. So the young black man made his way to the Virginia Tidewater region, where he changed his name to Ty. Ty settled in Williamsburg, Virginia, and initially made his living performing a series of odd jobs. Eventually, he enlisted in Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, took to his new life under arms like a fish to war, and distinguished himself. The fortunes of war eventually returned him to New Jersey, and he ended up where he had once been enslaved, Monmouth County, as a freeman under arms in British service. There, he ended up distinguishing himself and earning a place in history as Colonel Ty. Number 11. Blacks in the Civil War between Patriots and Loyalists. Titus Cornelius, or Ty as he named himself after escaping slavery, had his first combat experience at the Battle of Monmouth on June 28, 1778. During the battle, Ty distinguished himself by capturing a Patriot captain of the Monmouth militia and returned with his captive to British-held New York City. Having grown up in Monmouth County, Ty had intimate knowledge of the local geography that made him well suited to the guerrilla warfare that racked the region. While the Redcoats and the Continental Army fought each other in formal pitched battles, a nasty civil war was simultaneously being fought between Loyalist and Patriot militias and armed bands throughout much of the colonies. Number 10. New Jersey's Black Guerrillas. The guerrilla warfare was intense in New Jersey, a border region sandwiched between the British stronghold of New York and the Patriot capital of Philadelphia. In Monmouth County things got particularly vicious, as Patriot vigilantes took to hanging Loyalists and confiscating their property. That prompted William Franklin, New Jersey's Loyalist governor, despite being Benjamin Franklin's son, to sponsor Loyalists in fighting fire with fire. In July of 1779, Tye led a racially integrated guerrilla group of black and white Loyalists in a daring raid on Shrewsbury, New Jersey in Patriot territory. They captured dozens of cattle and horses, as well as 2 prominent local patriots. Tye and his men eventually set up a base in Sandy Hook, at the northern end of the Jersey shore, which they named Refugee Town. From there, they conducted a series of nighttime raids that targeted prominent patriots, particularly slaveholders. Number 9. Colonel Tye. Cornelius Tye proved himself a successful guerrilla leader in the summer of 1779. He led his band of black and white Loyalists in a hit-and-run campaign that terrorized and enraged the local patriots, seizing food and provisions, destroying property, and freeing numerous slaves. It was during this period that Tye became known as Colonel Tye, an honorific bestowed upon him by the British, albeit not an actual rank. By the winter of 1779, Colonel Tye, after distinguishing himself in combat, joined a detachment of the Black Brigade, a unit of about 24 black Loyalists. They fought alongside the Queen's Rangers, a white Loyalist unit that was eventually integrated by incorporating into its ranks the Black Brigade, and black Loyalists from some other units. Number 8. The Guerrilla Campaign in Monmouth, New Jersey. By 1779, the war in the northern colonies had entered a stalemate, so units such as the Queen's Rangers and the Black Brigade fought to defend the Loyalist stronghold in New York, while the British shifted their military focus to the southern colonies. The Black Brigade continued Tye's guerrilla campaign of raiding into Patriot-held territory in Monmouth County and the surrounding region. In addition to arming Tye and his men, the British paid them bonuses in gold for their raids and other successful military operations. The Black Brigade rustled cattle and other livestock, then drove it across British lines to feed Loyalist forces. They also seized valuables and captured prominent patriots, whom they took to New York as prisoners. Number 7. The Black Brigade's war against slaveholders. There was one type of raid for which Colonel Tye and his black men needed little encouragement or financial reward from the British: raiding slave owners. The Black Brigade fell upon slaveholders with a special relish, paying particular attention to the farms and holdings of the brigade members' former masters. They freed numerous slaves, or otherwise facilitated their escape into freedom behind British lines. They then helped transport the escapees to a new life as freedmen, and freedwomen in Nova Scotia or other British holdings. Tye and his men were particularly dreaded by their foes, as rumors flew that the Black Brigade planned to lead blacks in massacring whites in various parts of New Jersey. Many patriots were gripped by panic. As one commented, "The worst is to be feared from the irregular troops whom the so-called Tories have assembled from various nationalities, for example, a regiment of Catholics, a regiment of Negroes, who are fitted for and inclined towards barbarities, are lacking human feeling and are familiar with every corner of the country." Number 6. The Black Brigade versus the Association of Retaliation. Fearful patriots in Monmouth County set up an Association of Retaliation and persuaded the Patriot governor to declare martial law. Throughout the opening months of 1780, the Black Brigade's raids increased in both frequency and intensity, as the fighting between Patriots and Loyalists descended into a cycle of tit-for-tat killings. In September 1780, Tye led a raid against a particularly vicious Patriot militia leader named Joshua Huddy, who had become infamous for his habit of executing Loyalist prisoners. The raiders captured Huddy, only to promptly lose him when he was freed in a surprise Patriot counterattack. Tye was shot in the wrist during the fight, a minor injury in of itself but one which soon became infected. He died of gangrene and tetanus a few days later. Number 5. Black Loyalist Stephen Blucke. The origins and eventual demise of Black Loyalist Stephen Blucke have long been shrouded in mystery. The historical record shows him taking over the command of the Black Brigade after the death of Colonel Tye in 1780, and successfully leading it through the end of the war. After the war, he went on to found Birchtown in Nova Scotia. The details surrounding the rest of his life are decidedly sparse, other than that he had been born in the British island of Barbados to a white father and a black mother sometime around 1752. At some point, exact year unknown, Blucke arrived in Britain's American colonies, where he married a woman named Margaret. The couple eventually adopted a daughter, Isabel. When the American Revolution erupted, Blucke was swayed by British promises to free all Negroes who voluntarily joined them, and became a black Loyalist. He joined the Black Brigade in the late 1770s, and distinguished himself while serving in its ranks. In 1782 he took command of the unit after the death of its leader, Colonel Ty. Number 4. Blucke and the Black Brigade. Stephen Blucke successfully led the Black Brigade for the remainder of the war, even after the British surrender at Yorktown. On March 24, 1782, Blucke and his men completed Ty's final, and failed, mission, and took part in the capture of Joshua Huddy, New Jersey's most vicious Patriot militia leader. The Loyalists finally avenged themselves on Huddy by hanging him in the Navesink Highlands in Monmouth County, New Jersey, on April 12, 1782. After the war, Blucke joined the exodus of Loyalists, and ended up in Nova Scotia. There in 1784. The governor commissioned him a lieutenant colonel in the province's black militia. Blucke was also tasked with scouting land in which to settle fellow black Loyalists, and decided on Birchtown. There, he built himself a comfortable and spacious home, and took up a career as a schoolmaster. Then one night he simply disappeared. It was speculated at the time that he must have been killed by wild animals, as torn clothes resembling his were found in the town's outskirts. Number 3. America's birth and the death of Black Americans' hopes of freedom. In October 1781, an Allied Franco-American force trapped, besieged and eventually forced the surrender of General Cornwallis' British Army at Yorktown. It was the war's final major pitched battle, as the British, exhausted by years of fruitless fighting and the mounting costs in blood and treasure, threw in the towel. Defeat at Yorktown led to the fall of the pro-war government in London, and its replacement with one that sued for peace. From the Black Loyalist perspective, that was calamitous news. It meant that the side that had offered them freedom had lost, and their former masters had won. Thousands of slaves turned freedom fighters found themselves bottled up with the British, in enclaves such as Charleston and New York, unsure whether the Crown would actually honor its promises to them. Number 2. Deciding the fate of Black Loyalists. The runaway slaves who had fought for freedom in British ranks had good reason to worry when the Patriots won the American Revolution. When negotiating the 1783 Treaty of Paris that ended the war, the victors' negotiators had added a last-minute clause, forbidding the British from carrying away American property. That property included the black escapees who had fought for the British. With the signing of the peace treaty, the fate of the Black Loyalist escaped slaves became a bone of contention between the Patriots and British military commanders. According to the terms of the treaty, the British were bound to deliver their black comrades in arms to their former masters. However, the British on the ground refused to do so. Number 1. Resettling America's black freedom fighters. In addition to matters of honor and basic decency, the dispute over the fate of the escaped black Loyalist slaves offered the British an opportunity to demonstrate moral superiority over the victorious Patriots. As the British commander in South Carolina put it, "Those who have voluntarily come in under the faith of our protection cannot in justice be abandoned to the merciless resentment of their former masters." The British commander-in-chief concurred, and ordered that such that have been promised their freedom to have it. George Washington was infuriated, and it was touch and go for a while whether hostilities would erupt anew over the issue. The British in New York finally resolved the issue, to the ire of the slave owners, by issuing thousands of certificates of freedom to Black Loyalists. The documents entitled their bearers to decamp to British colonies such as Nova Scotia, or wherever else she may think proper. In South Carolina, the British also honored their commitment to Black Loyalists, taking them with them when they evacuated the state.